Hi class, and welcome to this video which is going to cover the Year 12 economic topic of inflation, and we're focusing on macroeconomics, which is part of Unit 3, Outcome 2. Now what do I hope that you get out of this video? We're actually going to cover 4 key knowledge points. I hope that so it could be a longish video, but I hope that you understand what we mean by inflation and why we have a goal of low inflation, so I call that price stability. You understand how we measure inflation, and we do that by using the Consumer Price Index, and you understand the difference between things like headline and underlying inflation. We importantly understand the causes of inflation, including demand and cost inflation, so how demand and supply influence inflation. And understanding if we have a goal of low inflation, why do we have that? And we're going to look at the consequences of a high inflation rate. So we are starting to get into our second part of our study design for Unit 3 Outcome 2, and you can see we are covering 4 key knowledge points as part of this video. So you might want to split it up or move ahead where you need to, and I'll try and put some timestamps in this video so you can do that easily. So the first thing is, what is inflation? And why do we have a goal of low inflation or price stability? So what is inflation? I hope that we can understand and have recognized that the price of goods or services have changed over time. And generally, they have gone up. Inflation, and this is our technical definition, refers to this sustained, general, ongoing increase in the general or average price level of goods or services over time. So inflation is a recognition that there is a sustained increase in the prices of the goods or services that we look to buy. Now there is the goal of low inflation. We want the price levels to be increases to be relatively low, and we call this term price stability. And achieving this concept of low inflation or price stability is the sole economic objective of a very important entity in Australia called the Reserve Bank of Australia. Now their primary responsibility is achieving stability of the Australian currency. Now, when they say currency, what they are essentially meaning, they are trying to ensure Australia has a stable value of the dollar in terms of its purchasing power. They're wanting Australians to have a relatively stable ability to purchase goods or services. Now, the current target of inflation is for it to be only 2 to 3% per year. So we would consider price stability to be occurring if price rises rise between 2 or 3% per year. So why does the Reserve Bank of Australia target 2 to 3% inflation? Happy with price rises increasing by 2 to 3% per year. The government and the Reserve Bank is really desperate to avoid all the costs associated with high inflation, so higher price rises than 3%, as these costs are borne by the Australian consumers. They recognise that an inflation rate that is sufficiently low, so 2 to 3%, ensures that it's stable and predictable, and that is going to give them the desirable conditions for their overall goals, which is sustainable employment and sustainable economic growth. This is because if we have sustainable price levels, it means that price rises are not going to be a factor in households and businesses' decision making, because they aren't going to be losing purchasing power and losing confidence. So they're going to ensure the conditions are met for investment and employment, and this is why the Reserve Bank wants 2 to 3%. Now you might then have a question, and it's a valid question: why isn't it 0%? But before we do that, let's just recognize that the Reserve Bank of Australia has not always had an inflation target of 2 to 3%. In fact, the target was introduced roughly in the early 1990s. And what I hope that you recognize by looking at this is that prior to this, inflation was not stable. And in fact, at one stage, we were getting inflation of about 16 to 17%. But if we now think of 2 to 3% being roughly about here in our range, you can see that since that target has been introduced, the Reserve Bank of Australia has been very successful in ensuring inflation stays around 2 to 3%. And they have a number of ways to control this, such as interest rates, which we're not going to go into in this video. But you might have a really valid question of why doesn't the Reserve Bank of Australia target 0% inflation? Surely we don't want prices to rise at all. Now, there are three main factors of why this is the case. Firstly, small amounts of inflation allow for a reduction in real prices of goods and services without a reduction in nominal prices. What does this mean? We don't want our prices to actually go down. That would be suppliers would not be happy with that. So having an inflation rate of 2 to 3% gives us a bit of wiggle room to ensure that prices don't go down at all. And we don't need to worry too much about real versus nominal prices at the moment. But we also recognize some of this inflation, this price rises, isn't actually just because the products are staying the same, is actually taking into account there is a rising quality of the goods or services being sold. So as products get better, you would expect the price rise to go up. So some part of that inflation is just recognizing that we are getting, through technology and efficiency, better quality goods or services. Also, if we have a lower target of inflation, it's going to create other problems, or may create other problems, particularly low growth rates and high unemployment, and maybe something called deflation. But I think we'd all recognize that high unemployment and low growth rates are not things that we want. And we'll talk a bit about this in other videos, but low growth rates and high unemployment are potential risk factors if inflation is too low. So what are some other terms that you might start to see? Deflation is the opposite of inflation. This is where we have a sustained decrease in the general level of prices. It rarely happens in Australia, although 2020 was an exception, because prices fell by 1.9% in June and 0.3% for the year of 2020. What was happening at that stage? We of course know COVID was happening. So there was just not the ability, there was not a demand for goods because people couldn't go out to buy goods. And we actually know in that time we had lots of negative situations, low growth, or in fact negative growth. We had a recession, very high unemployment if there wasn't for the government interventions of JobKeeper and JobSeeker. So you can see that low inflation or negative inflation is not a good thing. Disinflation is another term, and this talks about a fall in the rate of inflation. So inflation still might be high, we might still have price rises, but the rate of the price rise is going down. For example, the rate of inflation between June 2018 and June 2019 fell from 2.1 to 1.6%. So we had a reduction in our price rises, we had disinflation. So I hope that you understand now what inflation is, how why it is 2.3%, why it's important. The next question is, how do we measure it? And we measure it using something called the Consumer Price Index. And then we're going to try and understand the difference between what we mean by headline and underlying or core rates of inflation. So the federal government requires a reliable measurement of inflation because it's such an important statistic, very important at the moment as well. So they need to have a really reliable indicator because they're going to make a lot of economic policy decisions with regards to inflation. So the most reliable, best indicator is what we call the Consumer Price Index. And almost always when you hear the term inflation in the news, they are talking about the Consumer Price Index inflation. This determines the change in the price of goods and services purchased by an average household. What they are doing is thinking about households in Australia, and they're working out what would be a typical basket or typical amount of goods or services that would be produced by them, and they think about what that would be within 8 capital cities. So we're thinking about what are the things that a typical household is going to be purchasing. They're going to be buying food and petrol, maybe spending money on rent, maybe going out a little bit, spending money on insurance and health, childcare, lots of things. They're going to think about what a typical basket is. And then they're going to look at what is the change in the price of that typical basket. So we can see here that in terms of in September 2017, so it's a little bit out of date, but it doesn't really matter. The total weekly expenditure was $1,594. And they have split that up into these particular 11 groups of goods that represent the basket of goods or services. So it's very complicated. As we know, the Consumer Price Index is calculated on a quarterly basis and determines the change of goods or services in terms of the basket. So we calculate this on a quarterly basis. I think the next one is coming up very soon in April 2022. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics looks at 100,000 prices of more than 1,000 goods or services in this basket. So it's very complicated, but simplistically, they are recognizing that the biggest expenditure at the moment for a typical household is a housing, so rent or paying back their loan if they own a house, and that's taking up 22.9% of their basket. It's roughly $350 per week. The next biggest basket is the food and drink that people purchase to consume, being non-alcoholic drinks as well, because that would be part of recreation. And hence we have a separate alcohol and tobacco basket. So 15.75% of the expenditure, around $250, is food and beverages. And you might want to pause and have a look at all the other baskets. Why do we use an index? What is this going to be giving us? Indexes provide a meaningful way to record the movements in price. It allows the Australian Bureau of Statistics to compare the average price from one year or quarter to another year. So the base of this index was 100. As the prices have gone up, which is the base year of 100, we're going to start to think, compared to the base price of 100, what has been the change? So for example, the Consumer Price Index for June 2020 was 114.4. What does that mean? In 2011, they created a baseline price level for a basket and gave it a value of 100. And now the price of that typical basket in 2020 was 114.4. So inflation has been 14.4% since 2011 to the period of 2020. So we use an index to calculate inflation. And here is some actual consumer price index data all the way up to June 2020. So if we're going to calculate the annual inflation rate, we're going to look for June 2020. We're going to find June 2020 and June 2019. And the inflation rate is going to be the price index at the end minus the price index of the beginning divided by the beginning. Just like you're trying to work a percentage change in anything else. So this results in a negative inflation for that period, which we know was due to COVID, because the price index in 2019 was 114.8, and the price index in 2020 was 114.4. So there's been a reduction in the price index, 0.3 annually. The quarterly inflation is where most of this disinflation or deflation has occurred, was 1.9% in the quarterly inflation rate, because from March to 2020 to June 2020, we had a big reduction. And if we wanted to work out the annualized inflation rate of that quarter, because from March to June is just 1 quarter of a year, you could times it by 4, and that quarter annualized was a giant drop in prices. Because what happened in March to June 2020? COVID hit, and there was such a reduced demand for goods or services, and supply was reduced as well. So there was a significant reduction in inflation. What we recognize, though, is that over the long run, it's roughly been between 2 to 3%. You can see this June 2020 dip below zero, and this was such a unique situation. Hadn't occurred like that until the mid or early 1960s. And we're actually now in a period where people are starting to get a little bit worried of inflation is getting quite high. Our price rises are getting above the 2% to 3% target. And you can start to see here is some current data up to December 2021. We don't have the March data yet because I'm doing this video in early April. You can see that our CPI is getting very large, and in fact is above the 3% target. So we're going to start to see, is there some negative consequences of our price rises going up? And you might notice that this is the highest level since, in this graph, the recording of 2013. So we've really been in a period since 2014 of low inflation. Even pre-COVID, we were rocking inflation of about 1 to 2%, which was within our target, in fact, below our target. And this is because we were in a period of low growth as well. So if we look at the data of our CPI of our 8 capital cities, you can actually see from the December quarter, we had a 1.3% inflation rate. Now, if we times that by 4 to get our annualized rate for that, that's quite large. That'll be 5.2%. And the price rises from December 2020 to December 2021 has been 3.5%, which is quite large. Now, if you look through that December yearly change, you can see that there's been a number of big drivers. Transport has been significant. Housing has also been significant. They've been the 2 largest weightings. You might want to pause this to have a look at the changes in per quarter, but annualized is probably more interesting. But even then you can see transport being the biggest driver. So why has inflation been so high? Why is transport the bit that has been driving inflation? Petrol prices have been going up. We know that petrol prices are very high. By the end of December, they were averaging over $1.60 a litre. And we know that post-December, they've even gone above $2 because of things like the war in Ukraine. So you might want to pause this to have a read, but we recognise that, and this is the notes from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, transport has gone up significantly. This is because fuel has gone up significantly because of increased demand for oil as COVID has left, or not left, become less of an issue as we have opened up. And there's been significant issues with our supply because of our supply issues emphasized even more post-December because of the war in Ukraine. We just know that housing is becoming significantly expensive in Australia, and new dwelling purchase prices are going up. Rent and the price of houses is continuing to increase. So it's important when we think about inflation that we actually do know what's going on. Now, there are some different variations of the consumer price index you might have seen in those slides. The first one we're going to call is the headline inflation. These are the inflation rates calculated that we've talked about. These capture the price movements of all the goods or services. So, for example, the inflation rate for the year ended 2021 was 3.5%. That was what you saw in those ABS figures. Now, underlying core inflation is a little bit different. Often a government seeks to gain a picture of the underlying pressures. So actually try to work out what is driving it. So they might try and exclude or tweak those figures to work out what is actually happening, what is driving the inflation, and that's why we call it core inflation. And they have a few ways to do that. Sometimes they might do something called the trimmed mean inflation, where they looked at the headline CPI, but they removed the 15% of the items that have increased the most in prices and the 15% of the items that prices have, increased the least. So removing the outliers from beach end, I guess the logic being that particularly the ones that have increased the most, unless it's a genuine necessity, people won't buy them as much. They might do weighted median, which look at the price change of the middle range of goods or services. Or they might do CPI excluding volatile items, which remove things like fruit and vegetables and fuel, which goes up or down significantly. So they're trying to work out, is this jump or reduction core changes in prices, or is it due to something that's a bit one-off that we can hopefully try and remove? So for example, the floods of 2011, and we know in 2022 there have been lots of floods as well, wiped out many crops and caused headline inflation to rise really high to 3.5%, the same as we have now. However, at that time they realized underlying inflation was still within the target at 2.6%, because we could remove the fact that some crops had increased significantly, and so long as there's some substitutes, people are happy to look for other products to eat, and that probably makes sense. I believe, for example, if bananas double in price, people won't keep buying bananas, they'll buy apples instead. So there's lots of other measures of inflation which you might want to have a look at, but they're not part of our study design, but they look at specific parts of the economy. For example, pensioners and the beneficiary living cost index looks at a typical basket that an elderly person would be purchasing. So you might want to be thinking or learn a bit about that in your own time. But I hope that has helped you with your understanding of measurement of inflation. Now let's think about the causes of inflation. And the causes of inflation can be split into two groups: demand inflation, so this is due to increases in aggregate demand, or cost inflation, and this is due to reductions in aggregate supply. So we're going back to our terms: aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Economics and economists separate the forces impacting inflation into those that are impacting aggregate demand, like I mentioned, and we're going to call this demand inflation, and aggregate supply factors, cost inflation. Demand inflation is caused by increases in aggregate demand. So price rises might be due to increases in aggregate demand. As demand increases, prices go up. I hope we understand that in terms of our equilibrium. And this could be, for example, more consumer confidence. And this can lead to aggregate demand side conditions and spending because we're feeling confident, and hence price rises go up. Cost inflation, or supply side inflation, is caused by reduction in aggregate supply. Increases in production costs, for example, will limit the supply of goods or services, but if demand remains the same, prices will go up. And this is actually in 2020 something that economists are trying to work out. We know we have high inflation, very high, But we're trying to work out, is this due to, for example, increases in aggregate demand or reductions in aggregate supply, because that will influence the policies that we make. And we can start to see here are some charts. And I know that we've got a curved aggregate demand curve here. Doesn't matter too much, but we can see that we will have increase in inflation as we go up the price levels, as we find different equilibrium points, which have resulted as a result of shifts to the right in our aggregate demand curve. So every time there's a shift in the aggregate demand curve, if there's no change in our aggregate supply, our equilibrium point will be a new one where there is an increase in our price level. And this is where we understand and go back to the causes that can result in a shift to the right of aggregate demand. And these are some of our factors here that can result in a shift to the right. Now, we will also have inflation at our equilibrium point as our prices go up if we have a shift to the left of aggregate supply, where we have less supply at each price point. And these are the factors that might lead to a shift to the left. So what are the causes of demand inflation, or a shift to the right in the aggregate demand? We're recognizing that that aggregate demand can be cyclical, and a change where it increases, where we have an increase in the level of demand and economic activity, can result in inflation. We know that aggregate demand has a number of inputs: consumer spending, investment, government, plus exports minus imports. As this goes up, and particularly if it gets excessive, we can have really strong aggregate demand, and this can result in shifts to the right, which can actually increase our inflation. Now, the factors that can include can be these ones here, which I'm not going to go into detail because there's a whole video on that. But things like improved confidence in consumers and businesses, rises in income, population growth, low interest rates, strong growth internationally, and higher terms of trade can really improve the aggregate demand conditions. Now, these are good things, generally, so long as they're sustainable, but just recognizing as demand goes up, there will be an increase in inflation. And actually, some people think that that's a good thing, because inflation is going to be a bit of a stabilizer, maybe reduce the amount of spending going on, because we don't want it to be, and you've seen some words here, you don't want them to be booms, and you don't want them to be excessive, because we really want things to be stable and sustained to have a healthy economy. So you can see here, and we've gone through this, so I don't want to go too much. Here we have a shift to the right of our aggregate demand curve, and you can see that this has resulted in an increase in our price level, because we've gone from a equilibrium point at P1 to an equilibrium point in P2. Now, this shows how, particularly as we start to get closer to our aggregate supply productive capacity, increases in demand can actually result in really large price level changes, and this can result in it being unsustainable. Now, supply side inflation is when we have a reduction in our aggregate supply. Cost inflation or supply side inflation occurs when it costs firms more to produce or sell their goods or services. There can be a number of factors like higher wages and salaries for staff, increased labour on costs like superannuation and levies and all those sorts of things, higher charges for inputs like electricity, gas, water, for example, higher costs of transport, higher prices for raw materials, deteriorating climatic conditions or decreased technology changes, lots of them, including a few others here. All of these things will result in a shift in the supply curve to the left, And we can see as this happens, if aggregate demand stays the same, we will have an increase in inflation. So here, for example, we have gone from aggregate supply curve 1 to 2. Aggregate demand has stayed the same. This is going to increase our inflation. And generally, this is a really unfavorable thing because aggregate supply curve shifting to the left suggests that something is happening that we're not happy with, and it's going to lead to not just less goods being produced, but prices going up, and that's going to negatively impact your economy. So aggregate supply side inflation, many would argue, is not a positive thing, although aggregate demand inflation can have some positive because aggregate demand increasing is generally good, but one of the stabilizers is inflation. So now let's finally, and I know it's a long video, look at the consequences of having a high inflation rate. Particularly important now because we know we actually do have one at the moment. We know our annualized inflation from up to December 2021 is 3.5%. Economists are expecting it to be higher for our March 2022 quarter. So we are expecting a high inflation rate, and there are some consequences of that. The consequences are, and we will talk about all of these, 7. People experience an erosion of purchasing power. There is a less efficient allocation of resources. People do less saving and more spending. Often there will be an increase in interest rates, and almost certainly we will see that in 2022. We can have a loss of international competitiveness as our prices go up. Reduced business confidence. And then finally, we'll explore something called the wage price spiral. So quickly, inflation erodes purchasing power. As price rises, it's going to decrease the real value of your money, and hence you're going to be able to buy less with it. So as prices go up, what I mean by real value of money, if you have $100 in year 2000, so roughly when you guys were born, I know you're even old, we're born less than that, so let's go 2004, roughly the year you were born. And if you had in 2022 had $100, I think we would recognize that even though nominally we both have $100, the value of $100 in 2004 was significantly more than 2022. So inflation erodes the real value of the money you're getting. And this is particularly a negative impact of inflation if people's wages stay constant. So for example, we have inflation of 3% and wages only go up by 1%. People have lost 2% value of their money. Inflation means that consumers will have less purchasing power. They must pay more for products over time. And this is going to limit their material living standards, because we know material living standards represents the purchasing power of people. We also know that inflation harms those incomes that fail to increase at the same rate. So not only does it erode purchasing power, inflation can be quite inequitable. It often impacts the lower skilled employees the most because they are the ones who have the least ability to get wage rises. So the major consequence of high inflation is we have an erosion of purchasing power. We also recognize that negative consequence of inflation is there is a less efficient allocation of resources. High inflation can result in a less efficient allocation of resources as the businesses and agents in our economy look to ways to protect against loss of purchasing power rather than doing other things with their time. So consumers may divert consumption. Firms may be forced to raise their prices. Investment in businesses might be diverted away from wealth and jobs and looking to do things to protect themselves from the inflation. So they might be not investing in ways that can create wealth and jobs. They might be protecting in things that typically aren't impacted by inflation, like gold and art, for example. So it makes an inefficient economy because people are stressing so much about inflation they're not thinking about things that create wealth and jobs. High inflation can undermine the ability of a market to operate efficiently because we're less sure about the price rise means we're not able to make good decisions. And inflation can also result in a waste of resources as businesses will actually be spending so much time reviewing and communicating price changes and strategizing about the impact of inflation, they're not going to have the time to do other things. Other negative consequences of inflation, it undermines our international competitive because our export goods will be more expensive because our things that we're trying to sell overseas will cost more, and this will deter exports. It will lead to less saving and more spending. Logically, if you are seeing prices rise, you're going to be less likely to save your money because it's going to lose value. So you're going to spend more. So this means there's going to be a smaller pool of savings available for investment and puts people a little bit at risk in the future. And one of the things that the Reserve Bank will do in response to high inflation is they try and increase interest rates. And they do this to reduce the demand for goods or services because, as we know, increased interest rates reduce your aggregate demand. Now, this can result in our inflation going down, but this does result in higher interest rates, meaning there's greater costs on debt and borrowing. Now, the final thing we just want to recognize is sometimes inflation can create problems that keep spiraling, and we call this the wage price spiral. So if we think about part one, we might have an increase in inflation like we do now. Logically, then, if wages don't go up at the same amount of rate as inflation, the real amount of wages people will fall. Now, if you are feeling like you have less money in your bank account or less purchasing power, what do workers do? They demand a wage rise. They demand a higher nominal wage. So businesses will then provide an increase in a wage, and this increases their costs because they've got to pay their workers more. So what do they then do? Pass that increase on to the consumers buying their goods, so raise their prices, which will raise inflation again. And you can see how this could become a bit of a spiral as you keep going around and around in this wage spiral. So inflation can become massive. And in some countries which have really not managed this well, you can have significant inflation. We call it hyperinflation. In fact, I went to Zimbabwe once and got a $1 trillion bill because their inflation went up so much. But for now, and that's a long video, I hope that this has built your understanding of inflation, and you now understand what inflation is, and particularly low inflation and why we have it. You understand how we measure inflation using the Consumer Price Index, and I apologize for my pen playing up. You understand the causes of inflation and recognizing these can come from increases in aggregate demand or decreases in aggregate supply. And you understand the consequences of a high inflation rate, such as erosion of purchasing power, inefficient allocation of resources, and a number of others. I hope you've found this video useful and it's really built your understanding of inflation because it's a core economic measure and something that we should always be thinking about because it impacts a number of other things, such as employment and economic growth, which are the future videos.